In today's video, what we wanted to do was give you guys a little bit of a procedure on how to perform a daily field inspection on an accumulator. So this would happen when if you're a consultant or someone on site and you want to just be able to walk up to the accumulator, check the big systems and make sure that everything's generally functioning as it should be. It's not quite the detail you would see in a drawdown test, but it's just something that you can have a quick look at in a couple minutes and be happy with. So first thing you're going to want to do, the most obvious, is just to come up and have a look at the gauges. Usually there's 3 gauges: an accumulator pressure, a manifold pressure, and an annular pressure. Most of the workover and completion sites that we see around the US, we're not running a primary annular on the stack. So generally speaking, this annular pressure gauge is going to be at 0. If you are running a primary annular, usually you'll have it between 700 and 1000 PSI. Your primary system pressure is almost always going to be at 3000 PSI, and your manifold pressure is almost always going to be at the 1500 mark. So that's the 3 pressures that you should see on those gauges. If it's out of those ranges, then it's probably something that you should stop and check. Okay, the next thing you guys are going to want to look at is the position of your handles. Any handle that is hooked up to a BOP, you want it to be in either the open or the closed position corresponding to what position the ram itself is in. What we don't want to see is just handles in neutral when they're actually hooked up to a ram on the stack. If you do have a handle such as the annular that's not hooked up, that's okay to be in neutral, and it doesn't hurt to have some sort of flag or sign around it that lets people know that it's not hooked up. You always want to have your handles labeled accurately according to which ram they're hooked up to. And most of our cases will have an upper, a middle, and a lower pipe ram, and we want to have our handles labeled accordingly. You want to have a lockout mechanism on your blind shear ram to prevent accidental functioning. Sorry. Up here is your high-low pressure bypass handle, and we always want to see it in the low pressure configuration. So the only time we'd put it to high pressure is if we were going to be shearing pipe with the shear rams. If it was in high pressure bypass mode, you would usually see 3000 PSI on your manifold pressure gauge. So that would obviously be an indication that something is wrong. After your handles, you can come down here and check your primary power source. So in this case, it's a combustion engine. You know, we want to check that there's some fuel in here. That's something that we do catch on a regular basis. As the fuel level gets low, it's kind of one of those things that can get forgotten quite easily. Then the other really big thing is to make sure that your starting mechanism is in auto start mode. So ours is electric, and it'll say on the display here that it's in auto, and if you just hit the auto button, that's how you would ensure as well. A lot of the other accumulators have sort of a manual 3-position switch that'll have an on position, an off position, and an auto position. So you want to make sure it's all the way over to that auto function. For your secondary power source, if you have 2 combustion engines, like some of the deep well accumulators, you would just come over and check the auto start function on that in the same way. If we have these electrical motors, then we just have to make sure that the switch is set to on, and then the programming within the box and the generator itself is set to come on when that pressure drops by 15% or more. While we're over here, if you look down on the ground or down on the floor here closer to the tank, you'll see suction valves where the fluid gets drawn out of the reservoir tank and into the pumps. It's rare that those would be closed, but it is something you can check to make sure those suction valves are open. If they weren't open, the initial build-up test wouldn't have passed. So it's usually a pretty good indication that they're open, but it's worth checking as well. We have a sight glass over here where you can read the oil level. You want to make sure when the accumulator is fully charged to 3000 PSI that you do have, you know, a substantial amount of oil left, you know, about 1/3 of the tank or so. If you don't have a sight glass, what you can do is you can go over to the side of the tank, and then there's a little port that you can open, shine a little flashlight in there, and just make sure that there's a good level of oil in the bottom of the reservoir. Also over here we have our accumulator bank, so consisting of, in this case, 6 bottles. Each bottle should have a tag that says what the pre-charge pressure inside the bladder is. Here at Deep Well, we check the bottles upon deployment out to the field, and we'll have the technician write his name and the date and the pressure inside the bladders. Generally what you want to see is around 1,000 psi. So if you don't see a tag, or if the tag has a date that's further out than 30 or 60 days, might be something you want to talk to the accumulator provider about and make sure that that has been inspected recently. Down at the bottom of the bottles, you have these handles. So these are isolation handles for each bottle or each bank of bottles. You want to make sure that all of those are open. So what would happen is if we had a problem with a bladder and we wanted to isolate that particular bottle, we could just close that bottle and continue using the other bottles without the damaged one, if the volume in the accumulator allowed for it. But generally speaking, we want to see that all the bottles are open, and we also want to check these gauges here if they're installed to make sure that the pressure in these bottles here matches the accumulator supply pressure up on the main gauge on the manifold. Now that way you'll know that each of the individual bottles is charged properly and doesn't have any sort of leak or issue with it. So some other things that you want to look at is you want to make sure that there's no obvious leaks on the unit. So check the couplers in the back, check everything else, make sure you don't see any oil dripping. We want to make sure that the accumulator is spaced about 80 feet from the wellhead, just to prevent drawing in any combustible gases. In the winter time, once it gets below freezing, around 14 degrees Fahrenheit, we want to have the accumulator tarped in and some heat on it, and that just keeps the oil in good condition and gives the sealing rubbers and elements inside the best chance of holding their seal. Want to check, make sure it's grounded, make sure the grounding rod hasn't been knocked off by a forklift or someone's foot. And then lastly, you want to make sure that there's a documented drawdown test. So we perform a drawdown test after the initial nipple up. It's documented and kept in the doghouse on site with the supervisor. After that, quick look over for general condition, damage to any hoses or piping. But other than that, that's about all you're going to be looking for on a day-to-day basis. So thanks for watching, guys. Our next video is going to have a look at that documented drawdown test and go over some of the finer points and some of the things that our guys look for on site when we're inspecting these in deeper detail.